Welcome to Swell Academy, students. Mr. Math here. Today we're talking about solving absolute value equations um, with one variable. And basically what we're trying to do is find a value for x which would satisfy this to be true. What I always like to do is a little review and just kind of the idea that, okay, what is going to give us a negative 10? Well, with absolute values, a negative 10, absolute value of negative 10 is 10, and an absolute value of positive 10 is also 10. So actually, if you see here, we have two values that will give us the same answer here. We have two inputs that will give us the same output. And basically the idea here is if you spent $10 and I asked you how much money did you spend at the mall, you wouldn't say, oh, I spent negative $10. You spent an absolute value of $10. And if you went to work and you made $10, and I said, how much money did you make? You would say, I made $10, not I made plus $10. You're giving me the absolute value, giving me the distance of from zero of the number that you're speaking of, whether it be a negative 10 or a 10. So when solving a problem like that, you have to consider that there's going to be two possible answers for x. So when and if you see here, what are the two things that give me 10? 10 and negative 10. So what we'll do is we'll split this equation, x plus 8, into two equations by changing what it is equal to. So if you see, the original equation was absolute value x plus 8 equals 10. So I set up my first one, x plus 8 is equal to 10, no change. Here the change is made by the negative 10. Sign changes here. We change it from a positive 10 to a negative 10. If you had a negative 10 here, this would change to a positive 10. And then you would just solve each equation separately, and by using your inverse operations, subtracting 8 from both sides, x, 10 minus 8 is 2. And if you see 2 plus 8 is 10, absolute value of 10 is 10. So here's one of my answers. Another, your other equation here, you're subtracting 8 from both sides, x is equal to, now remember, if you are combining two numbers of the same sign, you're basically adding to a total of that number. So I have a total of negative 18 here. And if I do negative 18 plus 10, or I'm sorry, plus 8, like I have in the absolute value here, I would get that negative 10. And that is one of my answers I can use to get a 10. So my two answers for my absolute value equation are 2 and negative 18. So keep in mind, anytime you're working with this, you're going to end up with two answers or two values for x. So always keep that in mind. Now let's look at a different problem here, one in which you actually don't have the absolute value by itself in the beginning, meaning you have a negative 10 and a 10 here that you're working with, or a 2 and a negative 10 that you actually have to move before you work with the absolute value equation. So you can treat this almost like this x plus 4 is a variable. Like this x plus 4 minus 10 is equal to 20 is kind of like a 2x minus 10 is equal to 20. You want to get this by itself, this here, this x plus 4, before you solve for it. So in order to do that, what we want to do is first, just like regular algebra solving for a letter, you want to add the 10 to both sides and get the 2x plus 4 is equal to 30. And then you want to, if this number is next to a parentheses or absolute value, basically you're saying that's multiplication. So we're going to divide both sides by 2. And then we get x plus 4 is equal to 15. That green on green actually looks pretty cool. And then like we spoke about, there's two values that are going to give you a negative 15. Absolute value of negative 15 and the absolute value of positive 15. So we want to solve for both of those. And what we'll do is we'll take this equation, we'll split it into two different equations. One in which there is no change, and you're just solving for x. And the other, like we said, where you're changing the result, changing the sign to a negative 15. And what ends up happening is you're solving for both. Lost a little bit of train of thought there. Looking ahead a bit. So we want to solve for what x is. Subtract 4 from both sides. X is equal to 11. Makes sense. 11 plus 4 is 15. Absolute value of 15 is 15. Subtract 4. X is equal to negative 19. And again, I like to show this. The negative 19 plus 4 gives me a negative 15. And that negative 15 will, in fact, give me a negative 15. One where we're kind of use a little bit of division here, which I like. And you know what I want to do here is let's change this to, and this is where I said I was looking ahead. Let's change this to negative 3, and I'll show you why. That should work out. Yeah, that'll be fine. So what I want to do is, again, if I'm going to solve for this, I have to, and I'll box this, I have to get this by itself first so I can split it into the two different equations. So I'll subtract 6 from both sides, and I get absolute value x plus 3 over negative 3 is equal to 9. And then multiply both sides by negative 3, and you get absolute value of x plus 3 is equal to negative 27. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this, or why I changed the sign here, is to change this to a negative, because I wanted to show you when you split this into two equations, the x plus 3 equals negative 27, and the x plus 3 is equal to, this is where I want to show you that if you have a negative, you're actually going to change this to a positive and call it a positive 27. In the other ones, we had positive answers, and we were changing it to a negative. So if you do have a negative answer, you have to actually, again, change that to a positive. You have to change the sign there. And then, again, simply one-step algebra, x is equal to negative 30. X is equal to 24. And plug those both in, check your work, and you'll end up with a 15 here. Remember, hard work makes math easy. It takes practice, some experience, learning from your mistakes. The more you fail, the more you succeed in this. You try to experiment. If one thing works a certain way for you, then that's what you go with. And just keep in mind a couple things we went over. The absolute value, I'll just abbreviate, has to be by itself before you split it, right? Before you split it. Get it by itself. And then when you do that, one stays the same, one sign, and the other changes. And that's basically how you're going to solve this. And then you always have two answers there. I didn't spell that right at all. Getting a little hectic on this page here, that's okay. You'll have two answers here. Always, those are a couple things you wanna keep in mind when you're solving for this. Thanks for stopping by.